The flowers were already wilting. I noticed that first. The centerpieces on the long dining table, white peonies my mother had ordered from some boutique florist downtown, petals already curling at the edges in the warm air of my parents' house. I'd driven 3 hours to be here. I'd rescheduled 2 client meetings. I was standing in the doorway of the room where I'd grown up, holding a bottle of wine I'd brought as a peace offering, and the flowers were wilting, and something about that felt like a warning I should have listened to. "There she is," my father's voice came from the head of the table. Big smile, the kind he saved for when he wanted something. I should have turned around right then. "My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I'm a licensed civil engineer, and 3 years ago I took a collapsing regional construction firm, the one my grandfather built from nothing, and my father nearly ran into the ground, and I restructured it, refinanced it, rebranded it, and turned it back into something worth being proud of. I did this while my younger brother Marcus spent those same 3 years finding himself in Sedona, then Miami, then allegedly starting a clothing brand that produced exactly 0 clothing. I love my brother. I want to say that clearly. I love him the way you love someone who has never once tried to hurt you on purpose, but somehow manages to anyway. I love my parents too. That part is more complicated. I set the wine on the counter in the kitchen and hugged my mother, who smelled like the same perfume she'd worn my entire life, and I told myself this was just a family dinner. Nothing more. My mother had called it a catch-up. My father had texted that he had some news about the business. I had assumed quarterly updates. A conversation about the expansion into Charlotte I'd been proposing for 6 months. I was wrong about all of it. Marcus arrived 20 minutes after I did with his girlfriend Priya, who I actually liked very much. She was a pediatric nurse and the most grounded person my brother had ever dated. He hugged me at the door and said, "You look tired," in the way that people who don't work 70-hour weeks say it to people who do, which is to say, without any awareness that it lands like an insult. "I'm fine," I said. "Long drive." We sat down to dinner. My mother had cooked, which she loved to do, and for a while it was fine. We talked about Priya's hospital rotation, about my niece's soccer league, about the neighborhood and the neighbors, and all the comfortable surface-level things families talk about when everyone is carefully not talking about something else. Then my father cleared his throat and reached under his chair and pulled out a manila folder, and I felt the temperature in the room change. "I've been doing some thinking," he said, "about the future of the firm." I set my fork down. "The firm is in excellent shape," I said, because it was. Our Q3 numbers had been the strongest in 11 years. I had the reports. I could cite them in my sleep. "It is," my father agreed, nodding the way someone nods when they're about to tell you that none of that matters. "You've done a wonderful job, Claire. Your grandfather would be proud." He said it like a door closing. "Marcus has been doing a lot of growing," my mother said, not quite looking at me. I looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at his plate. "I've been thinking," my father continued, "that it's time to talk about bringing Marcus into the company in a leadership capacity." The word leadership landed on the table like something dropped from a height. "Marcus doesn't have any experience in construction," I said. I kept my voice level. I had learned, over years of being the responsible one, how to keep my voice level when everything in my chest was not level at all. "He's family," my father said, as though that were a qualification. "So am I said. My father looked at me then, and I saw something shift in his face. A quick recalibration, the expression of a man who had prepared for this conversation and was now executing it. He opened the manila folder. "I've had some documents drawn up," he said. "A restructuring plan. It would bring Marcus in as co-CEO, give him a 40% equity stake. I own 42% of that company," I said. "Your grandfather's original stake was 60%, my father said. The restructuring would reallocate." No. The word came out clean and flat and final. Not loud, not angry, just a closed door. My mother made a small sound. My father blinked. "Claire, I restructured that firm," I said. "I negotiated the refinancing. I brought in 7 new contracts in the first year alone. I rebuilt the management team from the ground up. I have been working 16-hour days for 3 years to make that company solvent. And you are sitting here telling me that you want to hand 40% of it to someone who has never read a construction contract in his life. It's a family business, my father said. It should reflect the whole family. Then Marcus can start in project management and work his way up like everyone else does, I said, but I am not signing over equity. The dinner dissolved after that. Not loudly. My family didn't do loud. We did cold silences and significant looks and conversations that happened in other rooms, voices low enough that you couldn't quite make out the words. I helped clear the table. I drank half a glass of wine. I waited for someone to say something real, and no one did. I drove back to my apartment that night thinking it was over, that I had said no clearly and firmly, and that would be the end of it. I was wrong about that too. The thing about being the capable one in a family is that people confuse your capability with availability. They see someone who can handle things, and they assume that means she will, indefinitely, without complaint, without limits, without anything to protect for herself. I had been handling things since I was 17 years old. I handled my parents' mortgage when my father's first business venture failed. I handled Marcus's college application because my mother was dealing with her sister's illness, and my father was overwhelmed. I handled the estate paperwork when my grandfather died, sitting in an attorney's office for 4 hours with a grief I hadn't fully processed yet, signing documents and making decisions because someone had to. I had always been that someone. The firm, Alderman Construction, my grandfather's name, had been in genuine crisis when I came in. My father had been running it for 6 years and had made 3 catastrophic decisions in quick succession: a bad commercial contract, an equipment lease he didn't read carefully enough, and a staffing situation that had resulted in a lawsuit. When I did my initial assessment, the company was 8 months from insolvency. I want to be fair to my father. He is not a bad man. He is a man who is better at wanting things than achieving them, and who had spent decades buffered from the consequences of that by my grandfather's work, and then eventually by mine. I saved that company. I want to say it plainly because I spent too long in my family being modest about things I had earned the right to say plainly. I saved it, and it was mine, and I was not going to hand pieces of it away because my father had printed out some documents at home and called them a restructuring plan. What I didn't know was that he had also called an attorney. 3 weeks after the dinner, my father's lawyer sent a letter to my office. It cited a clause in my grandfather's original partnership agreement, a clause I had seen before, one I knew about, one that I had specifically have reviewed when I took over the firm. My own attorney, a woman named Deborah who had been practicing corporate law for 23 years and who I trusted more than almost anyone, had told me at the time that the clause was largely unenforceable given the subsequent restructuring documents I'd signed. But my father's lawyer was creative. The argument was that the original equity allocation, the 60% that had transferred to my father upon my grandfather's death, superseded the restructuring agreement I'd negotiated, and that as a result my father had the authority to reallocate shares within the family without my consent. It was wrong. Deborah told me immediately it was wrong. But wrong things cost money to fight, and they knew that. I sat in Deborah's office on a Tuesday morning in November and read the letter twice, and then set it down on her desk very carefully. "How long do we have?" I asked. 30 days before they can file," she said. "But Claire, there's something else." She slid another document across the desk. It was a draft shareholder meeting notice. My father had scheduled a formal vote. He hadn't told me. He had noticed the meeting using contact information for shareholders on file, which included my father himself, Marcus, and 2 minor stakeholders who were old friends of my grandfather's who hadn't been involved in the company in a decade. He had scheduled it for the following month, at the family house. He had not scheduled it at the company offices. He had not notified me through proper channels. "He's going to try to outvote you," Deborah said. "He doesn't have the votes," I said. "He might," she said, "if the 2 legacy shareholders side with him, combined with his own stake and whatever he's promised. Marcus doesn't have a stake yet." "No," she said, "but he might be planning to issue one." I looked out the window of her office at the gray November sky, and I thought about the wilting flowers on my mother's dining table, and I thought about how I had always known, somewhere underneath everything, that this day would come, that at some point the family would look at what I had built and decide it was theirs to distribute. "What do I do?" I asked. Deborah looked at me steadily. "You go to that meeting," she said, "and you don't go alone." His name was Richard Ossie, and he had been my grandfather's attorney for 19 years before my grandfather died. I had met him once, briefly, at the estate proceedings. He was a tall man, methodical in the way of people who have spent decades watching families destroy themselves over money and have developed a careful, deliberate patience as a result. He had retired from full practice 2 years ago, but still consulted on estate and corporate matters for longtime clients. He had also, it turned out, been in contact with Deborah for the past 3 weeks. "Your grandfather came to me 6 months before he died," Richard told me, sitting across from me in a coffee shop near his home, hands wrapped around a mug, voice unhurried. He was worried about what would happen to the company after he was gone. Not about the company itself. He believed you could handle that. He'd watched you your whole life. He knew what you were. I sat very still. "He was worried about what your father might do," Richard continued. "He loved your father, but he knew him. So he asked me to draft some additional documentation, a protective clause registered separately from the main partnership agreement that established certain conditions under which equity could and could not be transferred." He slid a document across the table. "He also asked me to wait," Richard said, "to see if it was ever needed. He hoped it wouldn't be." I looked down at the document. My grandfather's signature was at the bottom, notarized, dated 14 months before his death. I had to look away for a moment. "He knew?" I said, and I hated that my voice was not entirely steady. "He hoped he was wrong," Richard said. "He usually was an optimist. But he prepared, because that's what you do for the people you love." I thought about my grandfather, his big hands, the way he smelled like sawdust and coffee, the way he used to call me his sharp one, when I was 9 years old and helping him balance his ledger books for fun. I thought about how he had watched me become who I was and had, quietly, without telling me, laid down a floor under my feet before he left. I pressed my fingers flat against the document and breathed. "What does this mean for the meeting?" I asked. Richard's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled. "It means," he said carefully, "that I think you should let them hold it." The meeting was set for a Saturday. My parents' house was nicer than it had been when I was growing up. I had helped them refinance and renovate it 4 years ago, which I noted to myself as I pulled into the driveway, and which I immediately stopped noting because that was not the kind of thinking that was useful right now. My mother met me at the door. She looked the way she always looked when she was caught between 2 things she wanted, warm and slightly anxious, her smile a half-second too slow. "I'm glad you came," she said. "Where else would I be?" I said, and hugged her, and meant it. The living room had been arranged to feel official. Chairs in a rough semicircle, my father's desk chair at the front, papers laid out on the coffee table. Marcus was already there, sitting with Priya, who he had apparently also brought, though she was not a shareholder. My father was standing near the window, and when I came in, he did the big smile again and said, "Claire," in the tone of someone who is trying to seem magnanimous. The 2 legacy shareholders, Mr. Peterson and Mr. Peterson, and Mr. Halverson, both in their 70s, both men who had gone fishing with my grandfather for 30 years, were sitting together on the couch. They nodded at me. I nodded back. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap and said nothing. My father began. He had prepared remarks. He talked about legacy and family, about what my grandfather would have wanted, about the importance of keeping things in the family, as though I were not in the family, as though I were a manager they'd hired from outside who had done a decent enough job and could now be thanked and sidestepped. He talked about Marcus's growth journey and his passion for the industry and his fresh perspective. Marcus did not quite meet my eyes. My father distributed the documents, the restructuring plan, the proposed equity allocation, the shareholder vote form. I looked at mine and said nothing. "I want to be clear," my father said, his voice taking on that particular weight of a man who has rehearsed a serious tone, "that this is being done with the firm's best interests at heart. This is about the future." That was when I heard the doorbell. My father frowned. My mother started to get up, but I was already standing. "I'll get it," I said, Richard Ossie was on the front porch in a gray wool coat, briefcase in hand, looking precisely as unhurried as he had looked in the coffee shop. Behind him was Deborah, who I had asked to come as well, on my own behalf. "Good morning," Richard said to me pleasantly. I stepped back. "Please come in." The shift in the room when they entered was immediate and physical. My father's expression went through several things at once. Recognition. He knew Richard, of course, had known him for years. And then confusion. And then something that looked a great deal like the beginning of understanding. "Richard," my father said, "I didn't know you'd be." "I imagine not," Richard said, and his voice was not unkind. He sat down in the chair I offered him and set his briefcase on the coffee table, beside my father's documents, with a precision that felt significant. "I apologize for the informality. I was retained some time ago in connection with a matter related to this meeting. I thought it best to be present." "Retained by whom?" my father said. Richard looked at him calmly. "By your father, Thomas, about 14 months before he died." The room went very quiet. Mr. Peterson and Mr. Peterson. Halverson were watching with the focused attention of men who had known my grandfather and understood immediately that this was not a coincidence. Richard opened his briefcase and removed a set of documents, copies for everyone, organized with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how long each moment needed to last. "Edward Alderman filed these protective clauses with the county recorder's office 16 months before his death," Richard said, setting a copy in front of my father. "They established that any equity transfer in Alderman construction that would reduce a working shareholder's stake below their restructuring agreement allocation requires a unanimous vote, not a simple majority. Mr. Belt, Alderman was concerned about protecting the interests of shareholders who were actively operating the business. He said working shareholder without emphasis, but the phrase sat in the room like something placed there deliberately. That clause was never disclosed to me," my father said, and his voice had lost some of its steadiness. "It wasn't required to be disclosed," Richard said. "It was registered with the county and incorporated by reference into the master partnership agreement. Any competent review of the title chain would have surfaced it." He paused. "I understand it was not reviewed." My father looked at his own attorney's documents on the table. I watched him understand. "Furthermore," Richard continued, and he slid another document forward, this one toward Mr. Bivell, Peterson, and Mr. Halverson, who leaned forward to read it. "Mr. Alderman left a separate letter of instruction, which he asked me to deliver if and when the protective clauses were ever invoked. I'll let you read it." Mr. Halverson put on his glasses. Mr. Peterson leaned over. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Mr. Peterson looked up, and he looked at me, and his expression was something I hadn't seen directed at me from inside this family in a long time. It was respect. "He wrote this for you," Mr. Peterson said quietly. I nodded once. I didn't trust my voice at that moment. My father had not moved. My mother had her hands clasped in her lap, and she was looking at the carpet. Marcus was looking at Priya, and Priya was looking at Marcus with the expression of a woman recalibrating several things at once. "I want to understand," my father said finally, and his voice was quieter now. The performance of it gone, just a man sitting in his living room realizing what he had done. "Are you saying the vote can't proceed?" "Not as noticed," Richard said. "A unanimous threshold is required, which means Claire would need to vote in favor of any equity reallocation affecting her stake. Which means, Thomas, that her vote is not optional, it is determinative." The word determinative landed like a nail being driven in. My father turned to look at me then. Not with a big smile, with something older and more complicated and less prepared. I looked back at him and I thought about everything. Every late night, every refinancing call, every difficult client, every decision made alone in an office that still had my grandfather's name on the door. I thought about the flowers wilting in the centerpieces. I thought about being 17 and capable, and how those two things had been used as the same thing for my entire life. I thought about what my grandfather had written in that letter, which I had read the night before, alone in my apartment, sitting on the floor because I'd had to sit down somewhere. She doesn't need protecting, she never did. But I want her to know that someone saw her, that I saw her. that what she built is hers, and I made sure of it. Tell her I'm proud. Tell her she can stop holding everything up by herself now. I won't be signing any reallocation documents, I said. My voice was steady. I had worked for that steadiness my entire adult life, and I was using it now. Not today. If Marcus wants a role in the company, I'm willing to discuss a structured entry path. Project coordinator, a real one, starting at the beginning. If he works hard and learns the business, there are legitimate paths to equity that don't involve taking mine. I looked at Marcus when I said it, and not unkindly. He was not the villain of this. He was a man who had been positioned his whole life to expect things to come to him. But what happened in this room today, I continued, looking back at my father, cannot happen again. I need you to understand that. My father was quiet for a long time. The two old men sat with my grandfather's letter between them, and Mr. Mao. Halverson put his copy down on the table gently, the way you put down something that deserves care. Your grandfather was a smart man, he said to no one in particular. He was, I said. I know. Nobody stayed for lunch. Richard gave me a copy of everything before he left, shaking my hand at the door with both of his, the gesture of someone who has carried something carefully for a long time and is glad to have delivered it. Deborah squeezed my shoulder. My mother cried a little in the kitchen, quietly, and I sat with her for a while without either of us saying much, because sometimes that's all there is to do. Marcus found me by the door when I was putting on my coat. Claire, he said. He stopped, started again. I didn't know about the clause. About any of it. I know, I said. I should have asked more questions, he said. About what you actually did. For the company. I think I assumed it was always going to be fine because you were handling it. I looked at my brother, at the person he was still becoming, at 31, with space that no one had made him fill yet, and I thought that it wasn't entirely his fault that he had been built this way. It can still be fine, I said, but it has to be real, no shortcuts, you'd have to actually work. He nodded slowly. Is that still a possibility, the project coordinator thing? Call me next week, I said. We'll talk. He nodded again. Something in his face was different from how it had looked at that first dinner, when he'd been avoiding my eyes. He looked, for the first time in a while, like someone who was about to start from the beginning instead of trying to skip ahead. I said goodbye to my mother at the door. She held on a little longer than usual. I just wanted everyone to have what they needed, she said into my shoulder. I know, Mom, I said. I know. I drove home in the late afternoon with the windows cracked and the radio low, and somewhere around the second hour of the drive, the thing I'd been holding in my chest since I walked into that living room finally loosened. Just slightly. Just enough to breathe around. My grandfather had sat down in a lawyer's office 14 months before he died, and he had thought about me specifically. He had thought, she'll be fine, but she shouldn't have to fight alone. And he had done something about it, quietly, without telling me, the way he used to leave the light on in his workshop when he knew I'd be working late, so I'd know someone was still up with me. I had thought for a long time that being capable meant being alone in it, that the same qualities that let me handle things also meant I was supposed to handle them without anyone at my back. I was starting to understand that wasn't true. I took the exit toward home. The sky was going orange at the edges, the kind of end-of-day light that makes everything look a little more resolved than it actually is, and I let myself have it anyway. The company was mine. The work was mine. And for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't just protecting something. I was keeping it.